Hi, welcome to the podcast studio. My name is Bob Whitaker. I'm a research fellow with the Wagner Center here at Louisiana Tech. And this podcast studio is the result of a Board of Regents grant that I won a couple of years ago. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to the technology in the podcast studio so that you can get to recording as quickly as possible. Now, if you would rather look at a written description of this material rather than watching these videos, please consult the podcast introduction pamphlet here. It should be located on the desk next to the mixing board, and a PDF copy of this instruction is also included on the computer for the podcast studio. With that, let's get started with the technology. All right, to start, let's talk about the microphones in this room. The microphones in here are Heil PR40 microphones. And these are top-of-the-line microphones. These are the type of microphones that you would find in major recording studios, podcast studios, radio studios, etc. Now, the important thing to know about these microphones is that they are fire-end microphones, which means that the only sound it's going to pick up here is at the end of the microphone, which is why the pop filter is here. So don't try to talk into the side of the microphone. Don't try to talk on the top or the bottom, just on the end. That's where it's going to pick up the sound. The other important thing about this room is all of the baffling that you see tacked up here against the wall. And the purpose of this baffling isn't to keep sound out of the studio. It isn't to keep sound in the studio, but instead to cut down on reverberations. And what I mean by that is echo, basically. So these Heil PR40 microphones are so good that they can pick up the echo when you talk and it bounces off the wall and comes back to the mic. So the purpose of the baffling is to kind of cut down on that echo effect. All right, now let's talk about setting up the mixing board for recording. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that this green indicator light is on. Now, unfortunately, the mixing board does not have a separate power button anywhere on the device. So in order to make sure that the machine is on, you need to turn it on at the attached surge protector. So turn on the surge protector, and if the mixing board is plugged into that, you'll see this green indicator light come on. All right, so this mixing board, it does look very intimidating, but it is pretty easy to set up, especially once you've gone through the mechanics a few times. So as you'll notice, all of the Heil PR40 microphones are connected to the mixer using these cords. And so you'll see we've got 6 microphones in here, and there are 6 independent channels for each of those microphones. So the first thing that you'll want to do when you get started is you want to make sure that your mics, especially the ones you're planning on using, are plugged in to the mixing board and the mixing board is on. The second thing you want to do is you'll want to plug in the headphones. Now, the headphones are going to be the way that you check the sound coming into the mixing board. So you can use your own headphones. We've got a set of headphones that are already here. Either way, make sure that you've got some plugged in, and you can control the volume for the headphones right here with the indicated red knob. All right, so put those headphones on and then go through checking the channels that you want to use. You can use all 6, you could use only 2, 3, 4, doesn't really matter. First thing that you'll want to do with the mixing board is you'll want to come down here and you'll adjust these white levers down here, these sliders. Now you'll want to start out at 0. This is kind of the baseline for these channels. So say you've got 2 channels, 3 channels, and then you'll come up here and move these to 0. Now you can move these once you start recording, once you're listening to the sound that you're getting, through the headphones from the mixer, but this is a good baseline to determine where to start out, right? The other thing that you'll want to do is adjust these frequency knobs. So you see here, on channel 1, we've got high frequency, middle frequency, and then low frequency. Because this is a podcast studio, you're primarily going to be using middle frequency. Now, this is the frequency at which most of our voices hit, unless we're singing, right? High soprano or low bass. High and low frequency, these are primarily useful if you are plugging in an instrument into this mixing board, which you definitely can using line in or insert. But for just the purposes of these high microphones, for podcasting, you want to adjust these middle frequency knobs. Now, the thing with middle frequency, high frequency, low frequency, all these frequencies, is it's really hard for me to sit here and to describe to you how adjusting these knobs are going to change the sound of your recording. Basically, what you got to do is put on these headphones and start talking into these microphone channels and adjusting these knobs. That's how you're going to determine whether or not these are going to be useful for you. The other thing that you want to keep in mind down here is a mute button. So say for instance, you're in the middle of recording, somebody begins coughing, somebody's cell phone goes off, you can quickly push down on this mute button. It'll cut the sound coming into this channel, and then you can re-engage this channel by clicking the mute button again. The last thing that you'll want to be aware of when controlling the sound coming into the mixing board is this gain knob. And this gain knob is red for a good reason. So just like the white sliders down here, gain increases or decreases the input coming into this channel. But whereas with the white slider, you're doing kind of fine tuning with the input coming into the channel, the gain knob will greatly increase or greatly decrease the amount of input or volume coming into that channel. So you want to be very, 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 very careful when adjusting gain. The reason being is that even a small movement on the gain knob, right, even just like 1/8 of an inch, can have a dramatic effect on the amount of sound that's being taken in by this particular channel. So if you adjust gain, do so very slightly and keep track of the input using the headphones. And be very careful when you're wearing headphones or when you've got this mixer plugged into stereos or into the computer which is recording, because you can blow out speakers, you can blow out headphones, and you can damage your hearing. So very, very serious. So my recommendation is that when you are starting to test your recording, when you've got your headphones on, start here with the white slider. If somebody sounds really, really faint, then just ever so slightly move this gain knob, right? Just like that. And you can increase it or decrease it depending on what the person sounds like, but just be very careful when you're doing that. And once you've got the kind of gain knob around where you want it, then you can fine tune here with this white slider. And then from there, I'd recommend going into your frequencies. Middle frequency is the most important, but you can play around with these as much as you want. 0, as you'll see here, is kind of the baseline, but you'll play around with those as you record and see what turns out to be the best setting for you. All right, once you've got the mixer set up and it's sounding the way you want it to, and you want to start recording, there's a few ways that you can do that. The first and most obvious way is how this mixer is set up right now, which is plugged into the computer through the computer's line in and through the mixer's monitor outlines. So you've got left and right stereo channels here, and then this cord plugs into the back of the stereo, the podcast computer through the line in port. Now there's written instructions on the computer, and then also printed out here in the podcast studio regarding how to record using the podcast studio computer using Audacity. Now, if you don't want to use the podcast computer for some reason, you want to maybe use your own computer, you want to use a digital recorder, a separate digital recorder, then you can also use that same monitor outline for the digital recorder. You can also use these mix lines here if you've got the necessary cords for that. And then finally, you can also use these RCA record out sections here, this left and right cords. Now, there is one other option for the podcast studio, which is already available, and it's through this UCA device. So say, for instance, you've got your own laptop, your own separate computer, maybe a tablet, and you'd like to be able to record using that rather than a separate digital recorder or the podcast studio computer, you can use this UCA device. And how this works is you've got these RCA inputs going into this device, and this goes into the record out here on the mixer. The left here is for this black cord, and then the right goes in the right channel. Now, if you are going to record using this function, you want to make sure that you unplug this monitor out once you're doing that. But once you've got these two plugged in, I'll show you how that goes right here. Left and right. You then take the UCA's device and plug in its USB cord into your computer. And now what's great about this UCA device is that it is plug and play. There's no additional software to download. Once you plug it into your computer, it's going to recognize it as basically another microphone. So then from there, you can open up whatever recording software you've got on your laptop, maybe another version of Audacity, Adobe Audition, GarageBand, etc. And you can record from this mixer through the UCA device, through this USB cord into your computer. All right, now that we've been introduced to the physical equipment, let's talk about how to record from the podcast studio computer. So when you're recording for the podcast studio computer, the way that I recommend using this computer is to go through a piece of software called Audacity. The great thing about Audacity is that it's free. It's got a lot of tooltips available online, and it's pretty user-friendly, even though it does have some intimidating looking software elements. So when you are setting up to record using the podcast mixer and the mics, you want to make sure that Audacity is set up to capture Microsoft Sound Mapper input. This is the input line on the back of this computer, and it's from the input line that the computer is attached to the mixer. And in order to start recording, all you have to do is hit this nice red button right here, and it will start recording the sound that is coming from the mixer. You can see that the mics in the background are picking up the sound of my voice. I'm just going to get a better read on that by snapping my fingers next to the mic. So you see the input line coming in there. And now that we've recorded a little bit of audio, why don't we turn that off by hitting stop. And once you've hit stop, you can do all sorts of things to this audio. First and foremost, you probably want to save it by going to File and Save Project. And what it usually does with Audacity files is it saves it as an AUP file. Now this is fine, especially if you're going to continue editing the whatever mix you've got it or whatever the recording is. But if you are satisfied with recording, if you don't want to do any more editing, then you want to come down here to export. And with export, again, file, export, you can export as an MP3 file or as a WAV. And so these files are, kind of typical for podcasts, other recordings, especially vocal recordings. MP3s tend to be smaller files, easier to transfer, easier to edit. WAV files are bulkier, they take up more disk space, but they tend to be higher quality. So it's basically what you decide you want. If you want something quick and fast, go with an MP3. If you want something that sounds a bit more professional, higher audio quality, but takes up more disk space, then export as a WAV. Now, in addition to exporting and saving the audio file that you've got here, you can also apply different effects, different post-production techniques to this audio. There's a huge list of them here. It would take me forever to go through and explain all of these to you. But the great thing about Audacity is that there's a great online community to provide help. And you can go through the manual here, or you can go online, and hundreds of thousands of YouTubers, bloggers have used Audacity to create their podcasts. So their advice would be just as good and just as useful and more detailed than my own. One other quick word about Audacity is you'll see up here it's got the monitoring, and you can see the input coming in now. That is the sound of my voice in the background. I can snap my fingers again to give you a sense of how loud it is. So when you are following along with your recording, when you're monitoring, you typically for podcasts want to keep your recording around this point where my mouse is currently located, around -9. And -9 is a good kind of gauge for a podcast studio recording. It's not the be-all end-all, but again, if you want that kind of full, warm sound that you typically get from a professional podcast, -9 decibels here on the recording is where you want to try to be as much as possible. And that does it for Podcast Studio Introduction. I hope this video was useful. Again, if you are looking for more information, maybe written information, this computer also has the Podcast Studio Introduction in a PDF format. But otherwise, good luck with your recordings.